So welcome to the Global Summit Project website series, Global Institutions. It's my pleasure today to welcome into the studio Colin Bradford of the Brookings Institution. Colin is a non-resident senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Colin has had a varied career in both public and academic sectors. In starting the questioning, I wanted to take Colin back to the early 2000s. At that time, Colin bridged two very important institutions, the Brookings Institution, which he is still a part of, and CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Canada. Colin, I'd like you to focus on what we have often called the rise of the informals, and specifically today, I wanted to talk to you about the G20 Leaders Summit. You were an early proponent of the summit, though at the time, in the early 2000s, the reference was to the L20, right? Now, there had been leaders summits at that time. There was the G7, there was the G7, G8, there was even the G20, which at the time was made up of finance ministers and central bankers. Why did you and others, and in particular I'm thinking of our good colleague Paul Martin, who was both finance minister and then prime minister in Canada in the early 2000s, why did the both of you urge the creation of the Leaders Summit?
Well, the basic reason was that the G7 represented the North Atlantic world, advanced industrial democracies with Russia added on later as the G8, and Japan being outside of the North Atlantic world, but certainly being a democracy and identified itself with the West. So the problem with that was we were living in a world of 6 billion people at the time, roughly, and 6.5 billion people, and most of whom were not from industrial countries, not from democracies, and not from, were non-Western countries, not from the West. So it seemed to us that the G20 Leaders Level Summit would reflect much better the global majority, if you like, the world population and its diversity, than the G7, G8, which basically represented a minority of the world that was the more privileged part of the world. So it seemed important to welcome a more diverse and more representative group of countries into the global governance system to make it, if not democratic, at least more representative and legitimate.
Now, at the time of the creation of the Leaders Summit, that is in November 2008 in Washington, there was a very fraught discussion at the time about who should be in the G20 and who would not be included. And so the question is, what did you think of this Leaders Summit discussion about, who were the legitimate representatives and so forth?
Well, and in some ways I was very sympathetic with it because, in part because some friends were actually pushing pretty hard back on this. My view, though, was more strategic or more manipulative, if you like, is I thought we had a set of global challenges that required a stronger global governance mechanism than we had and than the G8 represented, and that to get it in place, we needed, if we got into a debate about who would be in it and who should be in it, it could be an endless debate about how to construct the architecture rather than putting something in place that could actually get on with the work. Because if anything, I thought we were late to the party, is that the mechanism was, behind the curve in terms of what the global challenges were and what needed to be done about them and how you could address them. And I didn't think that the G8, G7 could really legitimately do it. And so we had the G20, and it had the advantage of being 3/4 of nearly everything, 3/4 of the world's population, 3/4 of world trade, 3/4 of GDP, world GDP, and other variables. And so while not being selected in any kind of rigorous way other than size, it did nonetheless represent the major powers and the major cultures and the global majority, even though it could be criticized, as it was, for being the big guys, the more wealthier guys, the more dynamic countries against the countries that were smaller, less wealthy, and less dynamic.
Now, by 2010, the Leaders Summit was being hosted by Korea. You were fortunate enough to work with our good colleague Lim Won-hook of KDI, the Korea Development Institute, in a number of large gatherings looking at the role of the G20 and the hopeful outcomes of the G20 in Korea. It was important because Korea was the first country to hold a G20 Leaders Summit that was not part of the G7. And you wrote an introduction in a book that you worked with on Lim Won-hook, and it kind of matches up with Paul Martin and Paul Martin's statement that the G20 had been created to make globalization work for all. What did you and Paul Martin, what were you two thinking about when you were urging that this is what the G20 Leaders Summit was to do?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to this issue of how do you have a global governance mechanism for the world instead of how do you have the world be governed by a mechanism by 1/7, 6th, or 1/7 of the world that happens to be, fairly constricted construct of, being North Atlantic and industrial and democracies and white, if you like. And so the issue a bit was how do you get a mechanism that actually tries to govern for the whole world, to meet global challenges for the whole world. But also, I have to say, then this has been true, especially in more recent years, as the sort of inequality and social challenges have come to the fore, is that I think that within the G20 there also has been a bit of pressure coming to deal with, first of all, the global poverty problem through giving primacy to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, especially during the China presidency in 2016. And that, in addition, there was an awareness of inequalities and needs to pay more attention to income distribution issues, for lack of a better phrase, in all countries. And so I think actually that the engagement groups around the G20 have been rather more progressive than the leaders themselves in addressing the social imbalanced issues. So in a certain sense, the way the G20 has unfolded with the engagement groups being an incredibly large and important part of it, I think that in fact it has been more representative than you'd think a construct of 20 large countries could be.